What happens when environmental laws and rules aren't enforced? When the environmental cops just aren't on the beat? This is Trump on Earth. I'm Julie Grant. Data recently released by the Environmental Protection Agency shows fewer industrial facilities were inspected in 2018 than any time over the past decade. The agency also confirmed a Washington Post report showing that civil penalties dropped to the lowest average level since 1994. This on the heels of another report that last year the EPA generated the fewest new criminal case referrals for prosecution than any year since 1988. So what does this mean? Why does the EPA need inspections, penalties, and prosecutions? And how is the view of the EPA's role changing under the Trump administration? Well, with us to talk about this is Juliet Eilperin. She covers national affairs for the Washington Post and has reported on these issues. Hi, Juliet. Thanks for joining us.
Hi there.
So let's maybe start with some definitions, I guess. When we hear about inspections and evaluations, it might sound obvious, but what are we talking about? What does EPA inspect and what kinds of things are they looking for?
So they're looking at a whole slew of operations. This can be anything from oil and gas operations, drilling, flaring, things like that, as well as, a chemical plant, a refinery that's refining gasoline. It's looking at kind of just a slew of industrial activities across the country where you could have potential violations of some of our landmark environmental laws, things like the Clean Air Act, the Clean Water Act. They're essentially looking for operations where companies are not complying with the law and as a result could be making our air and our water dirtier.
So as you've reported, there's been a sharp drop in inspections under the Trump administration. Do we know why, and what are the implications of fewer inspections?
Well, it's a little hard to know why because, as you might imagine, the EPA officials were not particularly forthcoming with, information about what accounts for some of these trends. They did confirm the numbers. But as a result, there's kind of a different story on the criminal side and the civil side of enforcement, and we can get into that. But on the civil side, it appears to reflect the administration's priority that they are trying to work more collaboratively with companies, and they have even changed the names of titles of programs to try to say that this is really about compliance rather than enforcement, and that they would rather work with companies and try to fix things initially than crack down on them for violating the law.
But don't they still need inspections in order to get compliance?
They do. And in fact, even EPA's own website talks about the importance of inspections as a key element in enforcement and ensuring that companies are meeting their legal requirements. So it's clear, we're talking about this is a significant drop to roughly 10,600 inspections across the country, which is only half the number that EPA conducted at its peak in 2010. So it's definitely a significant drop. There's a broader trend, which to some extent reflects just Congress has been less generous to EPA in recent years, and so it does have fewer staffers. But this appears to be a trend that's accelerated under the Trump administration. So it's more than just staffing changes.
Yeah. And so does this mean that what? I mean, I imagine there are folks out there who would say, we're just not going to catch as many people there. I mean, we're not going to catch as many problems if we don't have people out there, eyes out there looking.
Right. So that is really what folks would say. They'd say they're not the same cops on the beat that there used to be, and that's a problem. I think that also, there were lots of interesting numbers that came out in this data, and one of the things is that they're also not initiating as many cases and kind of opening up cases and investigations, and they're not completing as many cases. And so that's significant too. That's all part of this trend, that what you're seeing is that it's not just inspections, which matter. But then when you're looking at what are the cases that EPA is bringing against companies, that also is declining, which both shows that relationship and potentially some of the consequences of those actions.
Okay, could we talk about the difference between civil penalties and criminal charges, intentional wrongdoing? There's one case that's gotten a lot of attention.
In August 1996, the owner of fertilizer company Evergreen Resources told his employees to clean out a 25,000-gallon tank, ignoring requests for safety equipment.
This is from an EPA video on criminal enforcement.
A 20-year-old man climbed down into the tank wearing nothing but jeans and a t-shirt. Paramedics removed Scott Dominguez from the tank and rushed him to the hospital, a victim of cyanide poisoning.
So that young man, Scott Dominguez, suffered severe brain damage in that incident. The poisoning diminished his abilities both physically and mentally.
Owner Alan Elias was sentenced to 17 years in prison for falsifying a safety plan and committing numerous hazardous waste violations that resulted in Scott's permanent, life-changing injuries.
So, Juliet, would you be able to give us some other examples of EPA criminal charges of intentional wrongdoing?
So criminal charges reflect, for example, when you're saying there's intentional wrongdoing. So one incident that listeners might be familiar with is when there was a terrible coal ash spill in North Carolina on the Dan River several years ago.
3 weeks ago, a pipe that runs under a coal ash pond collapsed at a plant owned by Duke Energy Company. Coal ash is the waste produced.
What EPA was able to discover is that there had been folks within Duke Energy who had been warning that pipes were corroding and that they needed to be replaced or fixed in order to avert a disaster. That's criminal negligence. And so in that case, these are some of the biggest, most serious cases. Another very well-known one that EPA successfully pursued in recent years is the Volkswagen emissions cheating scandal, where they were able to show that intentionally Volkswagen masked the real emissions that came from their vehicles. So things like that are extremely important because those are the kinds of cases that aren't going to be done by the states. They're expensive. They take tremendous resources, and it really usually is the federal government that brings those kinds of cases.
And in those cases, those companies and the people who lead them are held to task criminally. They can wind up in prison.
Yes, and obviously the sentencing can range. You know, there are a number of these cases where you're talking about a matter of months rather than years, but there's no question that there are steeper penalties, and so what we have seen under Trump in terms of that is you've also seen a really steep decline in the number of the number of criminal penalties. And so the fact that the number of, there was a very small uptick, in one sense, but when you look at kind of the number of defendants that were charged, the number of years of incarceration, all of that has also declined. And there is a very clear connection to some extent about staffing that basically, for example, under a law that dates back a couple of decades, there's supposed to be at least 200 criminal special agents in pursuing these cases. And what we've seen is that number has declined significantly. Right now it stands at 147. So there simply aren't enough people working on criminal cases at the Environmental Protection Agency right now. And that, in part, is translating into a decline in the number of criminal cases that they're pursuing.
And can you say those numbers again, the number that, that it's down to from what it was at some point?
Sure. So, under this 1990 Pollution Prosecution Act, the division is supposed to have no fewer than 200 criminal investigators. In December of 2010, so, less than a decade ago, there were 272 at the agency, and now we have 147. So it is just a tremendous drop. Now, again, this decline started under the Obama administration largely because as a result of a 2010 budget standoff between the President Obama and the Republican-controlled Congress, what you had was a huge reduction in EPA's budget. And that led to a real cut in the number of criminal investigative agents. But, that is a kind of tremendous drop that we're seeing, not, off the top of my head, we're talking about, not quite twice as many agents, less than a decade ago. And clearly that has an impact on how many crimes you can investigate and how many cases you can pursue. But one thing that's particularly interesting about what's happened with staffing is for the entire first year that Scott Pruitt was in office, because he and his aides made the decision that he should have 24-hour protection, it was taking people who normally would be pursuing environmental crimes and dispatching them on rotation to guard the administrator himself. So not only were there fewer criminal special agents compared to what is legally required, but then their ranks were thinned even further because so many of them from across the country had to take turns covering Scott Pruitt 24 hours a day.
Wow, that's really interesting. Oh my God. And is that being, is that something that's being pursued? Like, is he going to answer for that, or is that something that was considered okay to do at the time?
Well, it really was within the discretion of the EPA to make decisions like that, to make security decisions. And clearly, Scott Pruitt's not in office anymore, and Andrew Wheeler does not require 24/7 protection. So as a result, at this point, that's not, the office is not being drained the way it used to. And in fact, one thing that's very interesting is when Scott Pruitt last year had to testify before Congress, and this issue was raised, my colleague Brady and Dennis and I had reported on this previously, and it came up during questioning. He argued that he was bringing up and was going to beef up this staff compared to what it was when he was in office. And subsequently, they did adopt a plan to hire 164 criminal special agents. Now, again, keep in mind that's still well below what it's supposed to be, but that is a tiny uptick compared to what it was before he took office. And so they are building up this department. It takes a lot of time to hire criminal special agents. They have to undergo polygraph tests. They just have very strict screening.
Yeah, I see. And I wonder if maybe even sort of something that's more potentially widespread is the civil penalties, things that don't come to the level of a criminal penalty, but, getting out to so many different facilities to check for violations. And can you talk about sort of places where we've seen the reduction in civil penalties and what that might mean for, say, your average person out there who is concerned about the manufacturing plant in their town or something like that?
Well, one thing is, it is actually, we started to try to investigate this, and I think it will just take more time to look at some of these issues, because one thing that's difficult is essentially you have to file Freedom of Information Act requests to figure out where they've issued notices of violation. So in other words, we can kind of demand public records that would say, here's a plant where this is happening, here's a lead smell, here's an operation where they're putting too much lead into the air, or here's a chemical plant where they're potentially emitting, some sort of toxic chemical. Then the issue is you really have to either go to the company and see if they will say whether they've responded to EPA's notice of violation or not. The agency itself doesn't discuss pending cases. So to some extent, it's difficult to pinpoint with precision this is a place which is certainly continuing to violate, public health safeguards, after being notified. And that's a really separate question. That's where EPA has done its job and has inspected a place and identified a problem. So in terms of identifying places where EPA hasn't gone, it really, in some extent, would be a needle in a haystack. So while I absolutely think that's a great reporting target, it will take time to figure out what's the most effective way to pin that down.
Interesting. And so I guess this question of, and I think you've sort of gotten to this already in terms of criminal penalties, but how things are changing, meaning when you change this, when you have fewer criminal penalties, and I guess we're not sure, but you can see there are fewer civil cases.
Right. I mean, well, really what the fact of the matter is, one, again, obviously it's a little hard to determine this with certainty, but the question really is, there's no question that EPA is identifying fewer instances of environmental law breaking across the country, whether you're talking about in the civil side or the criminal side. And so the question is, are companies much better actors now than they were a couple of years ago or 5 years ago? Now, it's true that to some extent they're delegating these responsibilities to the states, and they're relying on companies to self-report and self-audit their operations in a way they didn't before. Now, can we trust all that information? Certainly, it always is helpful to verify that independently. But it's clear that, going back to what you were saying before, the stakes for the public are considerable, because if they're toxic air emissions that are, going into the air at a higher level than what's required, people aren't going to see that. That's, they might not be able to smell it, but it could still affect their health. And so that's one of the reasons why you have inspections as part of your enforcement program.
And so do we know, are states actually doing this work that they are being tasked with doing by the reduction in the federal government's authority or responsibility there?
That's an excellent question. And I think it's something that it really will take a lot of inquiry in order to determine. I think to some extent it depends on, the states, which you would imagine that they're states that are very interested in still enforcing their environmental laws. And so you could see more stringent enforcement in some states. But at the same time, there are others that might not be as aggressive in policing what's happening in their operations. And so obviously that's part of what happens when you delegate to the states. It's the Trump administration is a big believer in having the states take more responsibility for some of these functions. It also makes it, of course, cheaper for the federal government. But then the second question is, do these states have the resources and the interest in enforcing the laws the way the federal government does?
And you've mentioned acting EPA Administrator Andrew Wheeler, former coal lobbyist. And I guess we've talked about this already. He's sort of changing the paradigm, talking more about compliance than enforcement. Is this just a general way that many Republicans think about things, is we're going to work with business rather than try to use a stick to get business to do what we want to do? And is there necessarily some problem with that under the, as the EPA itself?
Well, this definitely is part of the philosophy of top Trump officials, including acting EPA Administrator Andrew Wheeler, in the same way it was for former Administrator Scott Pruitt. These men, both of who obviously have worked closely with many of these industries, see them as much more of an ally than, for example, their predecessors under Barack Obama. And so, to some extent, there is no question that that both Republicans and Democrats see working with industry collaboratively as a way to produce environmental gains and to do it at a lower cost and in a way that doesn't impede economic activity. So I think most folks would say that there is a level of collaboration that can yield some of these benefits. I think the real question is how do you strike that balance? To what extent do you defer and take industry's word for things? To what extent do you independently monitor it? And those are trade-offs that every administration has to make. And I think what we've seen is this administration is coming down on a different side from its predecessor, and we'll see how that plays out over the next couple of years, if not longer.
Yeah, and do we have any numbers to show pollution, how much money is being spent on pollution controls and things like that now or in 2018 in comparison to previous administrations?
So what's interesting on that we certainly do have one figure that just came out that refers to that. So for example, EPA, when it was releasing its figures, noted that it had compelled companies to invest $4 billion to control pollution and comply with environmental laws during the last fiscal year. And they were framing this they actually framed it saying that EPA had spent this money, which is not entirely accurate. The idea is that these companies had been forced in agreements to spend that money. But what's really interesting is that's the lowest figure in a decade, according to EPA's own statistics. So yes, they are requiring companies to spend money on these issues, but it is lower than we've seen before.
This kind of change of philosophy from more enforcement to more compliance, is this causing Andrew Wheeler any pushback as his confirmation is being considered?
Really, the lawmakers who are complaining about this are Democrats who will not be decisive in whether Andrew Wheeler gets confirmed by the Senate. So while, for example, Democrats are touting this as an important issue, and while some Republicans are raising other issues about how Andrew Wheeler and the EPA is going about enforcing the law and pursuing different policy priorities, the issue of enforcement is simply not going to be a decisive one in his upcoming confirmation.
Okay. And just to wrap up, I just wonder, do we have any evidence or examples at this point that the decreases at EPA are harming public health or the environment? I mean, is this trickling down at this point to the average person in America?
I think that it is difficult to tell broadly how this question of enforcement is playing out. You'd really have to look case by case in different communities across the country and see whether there are problem operations and how they're being enforced. There are also broader policy questions, right, in terms of how the administration is rolling back a number of different rules and what ripple effects that could have for Americans. So that's a broader policy question. I think in terms of this specific issue of enforcement, most experts across the political spectrum would say that there will be ramifications from fewer inspections, fewer cases, things like that. But it will take time to determine the exact impact. Also, it's worth noting that, for example, the Justice Department and the Environmental Protection Agency recently announced a major settlement with Fiat Chrysler, where they reached an agreement of roughly $305 million in a civil penalty because Fiat Chrysler cheated on its emissions. And in that case, which, by the way, was initiated under the Obama administration, Andrew Wheeler, as well as his counterparts at the Justice Department, said that there was more pollution in the air that leads to heart and lung disease and illness as a result of this cheating, and they were forcing Fiat Chrysler to clean it up. So even some of the top Trump officials would admit that when you have companies cheating, it harms human health, and there's really a consensus about that.
Juliet Eilperin covers national affairs for The Washington Post. Juliet, thank you so much for your time.
Thank you, Julie.
Thanks for listening to Trump on Earth. If you like our show, please rate and review us on your favorite podcast app and tell a friend about us. Our show is produced by Andy Cubis. I'm Julie Grant.